with Dr. David Slaughter. Dr. Slaughter graduated first in his class from FSU College of Law in 1977. He has taught at UCF for 42 years and practiced law from 1977 to 2006. And we're glad to have you here, Dr. Slaughter.
Thank you.
David. I'm going to introduce Thomas Dyer. Mr. Dyer has practiced law for nearly 30 years. He created Watermark, an LGBTQ publication, in 1994. He acted as editor for 15 years and published the newspaper for 22 years before selling it in 2016. And last up, it's great to have you here, Tom. And last up, we've got Christina Headley. Ms. Headley is an associate practicing first-party property and insurance coverage matters. She also practiced criminal law as an assistant public defender in the Ninth Judicial Circuit for 6 years. And we're glad to have you here, Christina.
Thank you.
So I'm going to start off just by asking make sure we're all set up here. Asking if you all can talk a little bit about how history has changed for the LGBTQ plus community over the years and how it's changed in law as well. And if maybe we could start with you, David, first, if you could talk a little bit about that.
All right, thanks. First of all, it's the first time I've ever done anything like this. Done other stuff, but in the I was born in 1952, so I was a teenager in the 60s, graduated from Edgewater High School, and then went on to what was then FTU. And at that time, here's some of the problematic things that gay people had to deal with. First of all, it was a crime, and officially wasn't not a crime until Lawrence versus Texas, 2003. For anyone to engage in oral sex or anal sex, and that includes straight people as well. So it was a crime. You had no job protection whatsoever anywhere in the country, as far as I know. It was a mental illness until the American Psychiatric Association in 1973 said, all right, it kind of isn't anymore. It's just maybe a minor, still a problem. And the vote was 5,000 to 3,000 at some big conference in 1973. The World Health Organization didn't delete it as a mental illness till 1992. Pretty much all major religions condemned homosexuality as a sin. And it was a question that was asked on the Florida application to become a member of the Florida Bar. So at that time, it probably wasn't really a wise choice if you could avoid it to come out, and certainly hard for anyone to have much pride in being gay at that point in time with all the stuff stacked against you. And would it be all right for me just to comment a little bit further about kind of where I got to, and then it kind of gets us up to 1977. It shouldn't take more than a couple more minutes.
David, yeah, why don't you take us up to 1977? Right. I love it. And I did want to mention real quick, for anyone that has questions, you're welcome to leave them in the chat and the chat room, and we'll make sure to ask the questions towards the end, just to let you all know. And we're recording this, so it will be available on the Legal Studies site.
Great. And just real quick, but boy, at the time, and it's hard to think back that long, it's a long time ago, of course, but in my mind, I just put it out of my mind, because when I looked at all the bad things people said about gay people, well, I wasn't that. I didn't want to be that. I didn't want to be, the only time, anything you ever saw on television was a drag queen or a guy in a beard with a dress in a San Francisco parade. And I looked at it, no, that's not me. And luckily, in both high school and college, I had a girlfriend who was very religious each time, two different ones. Only a kiss in the cheek, that was good for me. I was okay with that. And I just compartmentalized and decided my biggest problem at that time was to have some pride in myself for other reasons, and this lurking thing about being gay. So in high school, the another thing that can make you not feel so great about yourself is if you have a crappy father, which I did, and also you're poor. So what I tried to do is kind of build myself up, have a little self-esteem. So I did well in high school. I was second or third in the class. Everybody else goes to U of F or FSU or some other school, but FTU was the only thing I could afford. So I went there. I graduated first in the class, had a 4.0 at FTU. Our graduation, believe it or not, was in the reflection pond. They did drain the water, which was nice of them. But in June, imagine the folding chairs out there in the middle of June for the graduation in '74. So that's what it was. And then I applied for law school, and you know, I actually wanted to go to William and Mary, both undergraduate and graduate. I got in, holding for Virginia, but the only thing I could afford again, I applied to Florida and Florida State, and got in both places and chose Florida State because I knew I had to work for 5 years. So I go there, and as was mentioned, miraculously somehow, even though, boy, it was intimidating because FTU, is that a real school? Yeah, it's in Orlando. And all these people, you know, U of F and FSU, a lot of them, but there was somebody from every Ivy League school. I mean, there was my best friend was a guy named Bobby Ballo from Yale, and there was somebody from Harvard, Brown, Dartmouth, Columbia, Princeton, and a guy that I really admired. He was the basketball player of the year, who was a Rhodes Scholar and went to Oxford. Oh, Jesus. My God, how is this going to work? And it worked pretty good. I did end up somehow graduating first. And this whole time, I kind of avoided the issue, you know. And I finally met a gay person. Of course, I met a gay person, but I never knowingly met a gay person until I was 23. And it was somebody that I kind of liked, and I guess he kind of liked me. We started talking, and a friend of his was gay and had a partner and was going to U of F. And why do you keep talking about him? Well, you keep asking about him. And suddenly, anyway, we ended up having an apartment across the law school in my last 2 years there. He was more bold than me, and actually went to some meetings for the Gay and Lesbian Student Union, and said, well, you have to, you know, there's peer counseling, and somebody from the law school is coming over. And it turned out to be Jerry Fishback. What? David, you? And well, why don't you come to one of our, you know, we're having a party, you know, a whole bunch of from the student union are coming. And so I went, and there were some like regular people. Not everybody was a drag queen. Not all the women were wearing bowling shirts. You know, I was as homophobic as you could be, okay? Because that's all the images. That's all you ever saw. And I get there, Jerry's boyfriend played football. He was a receiver, no jokes, okay? I do have some really good ones, but not, Lisa could be listening. In fact, I know she's listening, so I can't do that. And on the track team, and I thought, man, that's kind of what I want. You know, that would be kind of good to have a life like that. And I started thinking about it because I never went to law school for any other reason than to go to law school. So I could finally look at myself in the mirror and say, you're not your dad. You're not a loser. You're not a failure. You pay your bills on time. You're someone worthy of respect. So when I got that, oh, I probably should maybe practice law, you know, if you do all this. And then I had to decide where to get a job, and it really influenced me because luckily, since my ego was satisfied, or really just the lack of self-esteem probably satisfied, now that I graduated first, and all the while I was playing basketball and tennis all the time, and I got really good at those. And that's where you can compete fairly. It's not rigged in favor of poor people, I mean, in favor of rich people. You actually have to play in the sport, and you have to go in and take the test. Your daddy can buy your way in, like, you know, Trump's daddy did, but you actually have to do the stuff. So I felt validated. And then I decided, well, I'm gonna go ahead. I don't want to work for some corporate firm. I got much better offers, obviously, than going to legal aid. But I wanted to help poor people. But more importantly, I wanted to have a life like Jerry and Dwight were going to have. I wanted to be able to find somebody and not worry about getting fired or having no protection. So I chose to go to work for legal aid. I even applied for a job at UCF. They said, well, if you had some teaching experience, you would have gotten the job. And the next year, after working for a year at legal aid, I did get the job. And I think I'll leave it at there because I've already taken up too much time. But in the fall of 1978, I started teaching at UCF, but we still had to kind of be a don't ask, don't tell. So I didn't get tenure until 1984, so I didn't have really any protection. And I think I'll save talking about GLCS and everything we did in the community until an appropriate time. So anyway, that's kind of me and how I got to where I am here on the panel. Sorry, I took up, whoops. I'm looking for.
It looks like we actually lost Amy, so I'll jump in until we get her back. So thank you so much for bring us up to that time, Dr. Slaughter. Mr. Dyer, would you like to add?
Well, yeah, I thought I would start out by just sharing a story that I think is really interesting and also tells you a little bit about how far we've come. I started practicing law in the early 90s, but I started Watermark in 1994, which is a newspaper for the LGBT community. And in 1998, we got the idea that it would be really great if in the city of Orlando, we could fly rainbow flags on flagpoles and things throughout downtown Orlando. It was a really bold idea. I mean, just to piggyback on what David was saying, these were really different times. A lot of gay people, even as late as the 1980s and 1990s, were kind of living underground lives, and it was something you had to be careful about. So we just thought this would be a great idea, and we've completed the application, excuse me. We got funding to pay for the flags, and we got approval. It kind of slid in, and the city approved that we could do this. And somehow a story about it made it into the Orlando Sentinel, and the religious right swarmed on the city council. And they convinced the city council at the last minute to change the rules. So they adopted a policy whereby the city would only fly flags and banners for city-sponsored events, which is, you know, really outrageous because we'd already paid our deposit. We had a contract. So we got in touch with the ACLU, and with the ACLU's support, Watermark threatened to sue the city for breach of contract. And I think the ACLU threw in a bunch of constitutional grounds as well. It led to a really memorable 4-hour-long city council meeting in which there were so many people there, it overflowed into the lobby and outside. They broadcast it. There were more than 50 people who spoke, about half for, about half against. It led to a memorable speech in chambers from one of the religious right participants who stood up and said, I have research that shows that the average gay man ingests X ounces of fecal material a year in the practice of sex. If we allow these flags, we are condoning that kind of aberrant sexual behavior. I don't know why I felt the need to put a Southern accent on that, but
it's not inappropriate.
So, anyway, that stuck out in my mind. So at that meeting, not a single city council member for the city of Orlando spoke out in support of our community. But a slim majority did vote to honor the contract. And it was really not as a gesture of support for the gay community, but it was because they were afraid of a lawsuit and they were afraid of more publicity. And so I'm telling you, one lesson to learn from this is the power of 2 words, ACLU and lawsuit. So when this happened, and it turned out that we were going to get to fly the flags, televangelist Pat Robertson famously got on his 700 Club and predicted that hurricanes and tornadoes would descend on Orlando as a result of these flags. And that became fodder for Jay Leno and other late night talk show hosts, and it was kind of a fun thing. ironically, later that summer, there were no tornadoes or hurricanes in Orlando that year, but a tornado hit Virginia Beach, where Pat Robertson lives. So anyway, the flags
God works in mysterious ways.
Yeah, the flags flew that year. That was 1998, only 22 years ago. And they have flown in downtown Orlando, I believe, every year since. The only difference is that the city now pays for it, which is a reflection of the fact that Orlando has become a very, very LGBT supportive and friendly city. So that was 1998. 2 years later, Patty Sheehan was elected openly lesbian city council member. So that's just one really fun story. I thought it would be fun to share with you guys.
Oh, I think you're back, but we can't hear you. Uh-oh.
Perfect. Okay. I'm back
There she
in.
is.
I was admitted as a guest. Thanks y'all for going on. That was very interesting. Very fascinating about the hurricanes as well that particular year, because we get them every year except for that one. Okay, so yeah, Christina, could you talk a little bit about some things about the history of LGBTQ the community and law as well?
I think luckily for me, being a little bit younger than the other two gentlemen, they took the brunt of
Careful.
Way younger.
Easy. Little bit, just a little bit.
Uh-oh.
So I didn't have to experience much of any. I think my biggest concern was growing up in New York. I moved down to Florida for law school, and my concern was more the South being a lot different than the North. And while practicing, I practiced for a long time in Osceola County, which is where I, realized that they might not outright say it that they're judging you, but you can read it all over their face. But thanks to, Tom and him with Pride, I was able to be in a Pride parade here in Orlando. And I think because of what people before me have gone through, I haven't really had to go through as much as anybody back in the 70s or 80s.
Okay. So I guess if y'all could talk a little bit about your personal experiences while practicing law as it relates to being a part of the LGBTQ plus community. What kind of issues did you run into? And you talked some about these, but just kind of talk a little bit more about how that intersection between law and your experience in the community. We'll start with you, David.
Yeah. If I could be off topic for just a moment or two, because I realized that someone might bring up rabbits. We were making a joke last time. One of my exchange students would, whenever I was boring the crap out of him, Ollie, he would say, "Did I ever tell you that my neighbor has 3 rabbits?" And that was a sign to move on. So feel like bringing up the rabbits anytime you want.
Rabbits.
Now already?
No, we're good. Continue.
But anyway, when I got back, I did practice at Legal Aid, had no problem. Everybody was so supportive there, and you would kind of think that at Legal Aid. And I never had really any problem because I didn't practice as a gay attorney. People might have known, but no, I just handle the cases, and so there really wasn't much of a problem. But the one thing that I thought it should be mentioned at some point, this may not be the right time, I'll be real quick about it though. There was no organization here in Orlando when I got back in 1977. And that's what I was looking for, because boy, it was so great up at FSU to have the Gay Student Union. You could have non-bar related activities, and there was some counseling and all that kind of stuff, but there was nothing here. And when I got there in 77 and also 78, I actually met some people from then FTU. It didn't become UCF till 1980. And I thought, I want an organization like this. So I started one. Not just me, that's incredibly arrogant, but me and a lot of other people. But I drafted the articles of incorporation for an organization. At first, it was called Gay Social Services. Then we morphed into Gay Community Services, then Gay and Lesbian Community Services. but I did the Articles of Incorporation in late 1978. But my name couldn't be on it except as the attorney. So we had two guys, Bud and Ray, that owned a nursery up in Sanford. They were president and vice president. My sister-in-law, Ann Colby, who was county attorney for years up in Seminole County, just recently retired. She was the secretary, or vice. Those are the officers. And anybody who knows anything about corporation law, which I don't, board of trustees, which are the same people, just the next time you elect who you want as officers. So I was the president for the last month of 78 in 1979, 1980. And we got it off the ground, and we provided counseling, and you could call up any day and your call would be returned between 6 and 10. You could find out attorneys, doctors, dentists, counselors, a psychologist from UCF, Dr. Bob Millett, trained everybody to make sure we handle it right. And so we this is now what is called the center. So it was the beginning of, but there was nothing here in Orlando, and I did it for, again, a selfish reason and a good reason. We needed it as a community. And by the way, if I hadn't have done it, somebody else would have done it in the next couple of years anyway. It's not like it is that it wouldn't have happened, but I did get it started and was president for the first couple of years. And also did it for a selfish reason. And because I thought it's really hard to meet people at bars. They're drunk and drugs and all that kind of stuff. And I don't drink or smoke or any of that stuff. And I thought, well, maybe I'll meet someone like Jerry and White met and all that stuff. So I thought, man, maybe it will. And it did happen in 1980. Believe it or not, during Gay Pride Week, we had seminars on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday about different issues for gay people about different legal topics. And it just so happened that a guy named Jimmy comes up afterwards and said, I really enjoyed your speech. We started talking. And anyway, yesterday we celebrated our 40th anniversary. So it worked, yay. And I thought, okay, I'm done here. That's what I wanted. And but no, I was worn out, just worn out, burnout. But we got it started, and people like Tom Dyer joined in 1980. And thank God for Tom Dyer and other people, because they carried the ball forward. We had a lesbian, Ronnie Sauls, took over the next year as the president, and it progressed. And I kind of bowed out and and started practicing law, which is what you talked about. And boy, that took a long time to get to that. But every once in a while, I'd have a state attorney, because I did handle quite a few criminal cases where people got caught doing inappropriate things in inappropriate places. And we can maybe talk about the reasoning later, or if Tom, asked me to bring it up, but I think maybe later. But probably the only thing I ever got was, okay, so Dana, how do you get all these cases? And I just make a joke like, well, I got a sign over in the park. Haven't you seen it? It says, if you get caught with your pants down, call 843-LEWD. And that's my phone number. He goes, that's funny, man. It's really funny. No, just probably word of mouth. I don't know. And, it was no big deal, because attorneys represent people. That doesn't mean you're in the group necessarily. But I thought it would actually, I didn't know whether it would help or hurt my client. I thought the best thing to do was handle it like I would handle anything else. And of course I did, Tom's the expert on this, but all we could do was partnership agreements back in the day, because obviously you weren't allowed to get married. So I did some of those, but I kind of morphed into criminal because I was teaching full time, and I had maybe a couple of days during the week where I could practice, but I never experienced anything negative. I think a lot of it people didn't know for sure, or if they did, they figured, well, he's been around practicing for a while, and I didn't really experience anything that I could really say was a negative. But again, it may have been because I wasn't out. It was still a little dangerous to do that. Sorry, that was too much again.
That was great. Thank you. Yeah, maybe we can follow up later, talking about, I think you mentioned the,
Yeah, for why people,
in the parks and,
why were people
kind of,
doing that? Yeah.
yeah, because, there's a lot of reasons, I guess, that you had talked about before. And Tom, if you could talk a little bit about your experience practicing law, and LGBTQ plus rights and issues that you kind of have worked with, or as a person that's in the LGBTQ community.
Yeah, well, I kind of wanted to start by sharing a personal story like David. When I was in law school, I went to law school right out of college. It was the late 1970s. And as I was approaching graduation and taking the bar exam and looking for jobs, I was a bit of a mess. I had not come out. I was having panic attacks. I was drinking very heavily. And so I dropped out of law school with one semester left to go. And quite honestly, I floundered for several years. Finally, I got sober. I undertook a little counseling, and I started to face life head on rather than trying to avoid it. And at that time, I found that I wanted to finish my law degree. Obviously, that was something that had been left hanging that was really bothering me. So, yeah, I for anyone who's ever been in law school, you know that it's not really usually a terribly nurturing environment. And so I wasn't at all sure that they would let me come back. I was an okay student, but I wasn't a stellar student. So I sat down to write a letter to the dean, and I struggled with what to say about what had happened and why I wanted to come back. And I was trying to come up with what excuse would work. And a light bulb went off, and I finally just thought, you know what? I'm just going to tell the truth. I'm just going to explain exactly what happened, that I was a closeted gay man. I had a lot of emotional issues. I was drinking heavily, and I've addressed those. And now I want to come back and finish my degree. And quite honestly, I didn't think that it would be greeted very receptively. I didn't think that, I didn't give it much chance. But lo and behold, about 2 or 3 weeks later, I get a call from the dean of the law school. And I always choke up when I tell the story, because he said, Tom, I'm sitting here with the admissions committee, and we are looking at your letter, and we all want you to know how proud we are of you for doing the things that you've done and for facing your issues. And we very much want you to come back, and we'll do everything we can to help you finish your degree. So it was it was a real lesson, and I learned that boy, oh boy, people can, when you tell the truth, people can relate to it, and they can respect it. And it's a lesson that has served me well the rest of my life, and certainly in my legal career, in front of judges, in front of anybody. You tell the truth, people can relate to it. So anyway, in terms of me practicing law, when I got out of law school, I was obviously kind of an unconventional graduate. I kind of missed all the job interviews and all that stuff. But I found a place with a small firm in Orlando that had a reputation for being LGBT friendly. So that they took me in, but the issue was that I had to bring in my own clients. So what I did, and this was 1990, something like that, I placed a small business card size ad in the Triangle, which was a publication that came out monthly that was put out by the center that Dave Slaughter talked about. That's all I did. And honestly, within a year, I had enough clients that I could go out on my own. And you know why? It's because, I mean, when you think about it, the practice of law, you're dealing with usually very intimate, important issues. And the first question, gay and lesbian people, transgender people, they have legal needs and legal issues just like everybody else. But back then, the first question they wanted to know if they were consulting a lawyer was, can I tell them my truth? Can I be who I am? Will they accept me? I mean, you guys, you have to understand, back in the 80s and 90s, and certainly before that, it was a very different experience being gay. Most people lived underground lives, and they were very careful about who they told. And so me putting that ad in the Triangle, that answered that question for them. This would be someone who they could tell the truth to, and it just kind of opened the doors. Back then, the only other attorney that was advertising in the Triangle was David Slaughter. So
That's how I got the clients, actually.
So, and I do think placing this ad and the success of this little ad was one of the reasons that I felt it would be a good idea to start up a larger and more substantial LGBT publication, which I did just a few years after that. So the kinds of cases that you would get, could be heartbreaking in many cases, especially in the family law and estate planning areas. Some of the ones that really stand out to me are the ones where lesbians who were in marriages and wanted to leave the marriages and they had children, they were terrified that they would lose their children if they, if it came out in court that they were lesbian. Many of them had successfully hidden it. And so those were really tough cases in a different time. And also back then, AIDS was rampant and many people were dying, and they were dying at young ages. And many didn't get around to doing any estate planning. And I wish I had $1 for every person that came into my office that said, well, he thought his parents would do the right thing. Because if you die without a will, then statute determines where your assets go. And if you don't have kids, your assets go to your parents. And there were many, many, many cases where life partners were left out and parents inherited everything. And when they realized that they were entitled to those things, that my parents will do the right thing kind of went out the window. So those were some of the cases we're dealing with. I found very early on, I'm not suited to divorce law. It's a very emotionally challenging area. You see people at their absolute worst, but I enjoy doing estate planning. And that's where my primary area of practice is. One last story I'll tell before I go on, because it's just so cute, is at one point I had 2 older women come into my office, and one was from New York and one was from Germany. And the one from New York says, Tom, we're very close. We're cousins. Yeah, we're like sisters. And I'm like, okay, well, I'll let that go. And then about 10 minutes later, she got up to use the restroom, and her partner leaned in, the one from Germany, and she says, Tom, we are not cousins, and we are not like sisters. And I winked at her, and I said, I get it, I know. So that's the way it was back then. And so that's kind of my contribution to this portion of the program.
Thank you. That's really interesting that navigating even as a person in the community, but also as a lawyer or in law, like the double kind of existence, being not able to say who you really are sometimes, or being scared that you can't say it, and just trying to read your potential clients and what their needs are. And at that time, so that's very, very interesting. Thanks for sharing that.
Before Christina goes, I just want to compliment Tom on that story, because I didn't know it. I mean, Tom and I are friends, but I didn't know the whole situation there. And when you look back at all the stuff, the mental illness, the this and the that, if you were to come out, they probably would have taken you to a psychiatrist back, when we were going to high school or whatever. And it's a miracle. I would say just lots and lots of people turn to alcohol or drugs to avoid the pain. And then you can't go to your church, you can't go to your parents, you can't go anywhere. And it's just, some people come out of it earlier than others, or come fighting, or whatever the situation. And I just admire Tom for what he did to overcome it, because it was a real difficult thing for a lot of people at that time. I'm sorry, Christina, I know it was your turn, but I just wanted to pop those things in.
Agreed, David. I totally agree. I think that's a pretty powerful story. You guys both have shared some really, really amazing things. And Christina, if you want to tell us a little bit about your experience and personal experiences while practicing law, or in general.
So when I first started law school, I was not complying with the normal trend of how you're supposed to look. I went into law school with a platinum blonde mohawk, and I did not really care what they thought about it, which didn't fly too well at Barry, where I went to law school, which is a Catholic law school. They were not fans of it. They told me I would never get a job with it. It's gone now. They were probably right about that. But when I started, I always had the very short hair, and practicing. The minute I left law school, I started at the public defender's office in Orange County. Never really had any issues, but then you'd get the occasional one particular magistrate who refused to call me anything but sir. He was corrected. It's ma'am, it's not sir. He continued throughout the entire hearing with sir, 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 to the point where the client yelled at him, and I maybe responded in kind to calling him ma'am once or twice, but I've gotten that. I've gotten the occasional, hey, counselor, did you know I have a gay brother? I think it's their way of being like, hey, we're all cool. And I'm like, all right, you take the good with the bad. But I mean, the short hair, I get the sir all the time. And a lot of time I've had 2 experiences where they won't correct themselves. And then you're kind of like, well, what are you doing here? What's the point? But I think, as a LGBTQ practicing attorney, you take it on the chin and you move on. If somebody's going to be ignorant, they're ignorant. I'm not going to sit there and deal with it. They're going to be disrespectful. I'm just going to move on and do my job. I don't think it's ever affected me negatively or affected my clients. I did tons of trials. I've done over 50 jury trials, and I can tell you the first time standing up in Osceola County in front of that jury, you could see it all over their face that they are not too keen about me standing up there. But they never said anything. They held it in. By the end, they chuckle, go along with everything. But you see it all over their face that they are not too happy about it. As for clients, doing criminal for as long as I did, I don't think I ever had a client had an issue. I had some issues where had some transgender clients that, interestingly enough, jails have no idea what to do. They freak out. It makes inmates uncomfortable. It makes them uncomfortable. And then it's funny, all of a sudden they're like, oh, maybe you could handle this case. And you're like, well, we know why we're doing that. Other than that, it's just I've never really had somebody outright be hurtful. I mean, the sir thing was ridiculous, but I chalked it up to, well, he's from Osceola County and old. And growing up north, I kind of already had that in my head that the South was going to be a little bit different. But then nobody in Florida is really from Florida, I've come to learn as well.
Yeah,
But otherwise, I mean, my main judges that I practiced in front of for a long time were great. Would never allow anybody to be disrespectful, would never allow any of it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. If you could, Christina, talk a little bit about your experience representing a trans person and with the navigating that with folks that didn't really know what to do in that time.
So it was interesting. Can't, divulge too much confidentiality and all that.
Mm-hmm.
But the way it's handled inside a jail or prison is that it goes by genitalia. So if this trans individual has had surgeries, that is how the classification goes. Now, when somebody's in jail and not on hormones, certain things are going to come back, like facial hair. And that's what eventually started to occur in this situation. And it was making other female inmates where she was very uncomfortable. The funny thing is that ignorance really saved this woman, as before when she was a male, she had a very significant criminal history. Luckily, the ignorance of the state attorney who was on the case thought, well, that's not the same person anymore. And none of that went on, and essentially saved this woman for a long time. But the jail didn't know what to do. The jail immediately was get her out. It's making everyone uncomfortable, and they don't know. And there's not much they can do, and most jails don't provide the hormone therapy that these individuals are on.
Interesting. Thank you for sharing that. It's definitely something worth exploring and thinking about for folks listening. So I guess at this point, if you guys all, I guess, can think about sharing the way that the current situation is with legal rights and the LGBTQ plus community. What are where are we today, and what are some of the things that have made big shifts recently, maybe, or things that you guys want to talk about particularly.
If I could just jump in real quick, Amy, we had a question from one of our viewers, and it pertains to this. This is are there any legal protections in Orange County for LGBTQ individuals in a consumer setting? In other words, can businesses deny services to members of that community?
Thank you for asking that.
Tom, I think, I really don't know, but Tom, do you?
Well, I mean, there are non-discrimination ordinances in both the city of Orlando and Orange County, and they do cover public accommodations. So I think the short answer to your question is in Orange County and the city of Orlando, there are protections in the context of restaurants and things like that, hotels, public accommodations, renting, things of that nature. There are no statewide protections. They've been trying for that for a long time, but Central Florida is kind of ahead of the curve on that, and there are municipal ordinances.
I haven't read the decision. I just heard what everybody said on television about it, but I think many of you have heard of the U.S. Supreme Court decision that just came down that interpreted the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the sex discrimination provision to prevent discrimination in employment, and it's based on they call it sexual discrimination as opposed to orientation. It's a little more narrow than maybe we would have hoped, but still that now would supersede anything that would be covered under the Civil Rights Act. So it may not cover a person to person, like if you were, there are some, if it's a really small number of employees. I don't know all the ins and outs on that, but that is kind of a big umbrella protection that we didn't have before. And just with respect to, I totally forgot this. I'll make it quick. I think it was back in 1980 or 81. I actually got contacted by a student at Polk Community College, and they wanted to have a gay and lesbian student organization. Or I think they might have even been called a Great Gay Straight Alliance. I can't remember what the name was. But they, this is Polk County, and they ain't going to have that stuff at Polk. If you know anything about Polk County, I make jokes in my class all the time. I ask, is anybody from Polk County? And if there's no answer, well, of course not. This is a university. And when anybody is there and says, I said, but I am right? You go, oh, you're absolutely right. So I try to Polk County stuff because I did my internship there in 1976, and wow, it is a different place. But back, and of course they didn't want to do it. Jerry and I, my friend from law school, we took the case to federal court and got a federal judge to order that they recognize the gay student organization. We didn't know really how to do this, but we figured it out, and boy, did it piss off the folks in Polk County that they were forced to recognize the rights of these gay students. But we got some protection for the Florida bar in 1981. There was a weird decision. I wrote an article about it, and it was still technically a crime in 1981. But the Florida bar, there was a guy named Robert Eimers who refused to answer the questions about, have you ever engaged in this type of sexual conduct? And he says, it's none of your business. well, if it's a crime, it should be the business of the Florida bar, to ask a question about criminal activity. But the court said you can't ask a question about private, non-commercial sexual conduct with consenting adults. So my argument was, if you can't ask that question, then it's no longer a crime. If it's a crime, you should be able to ask questions about it. If it's not a crime, then you can ask questions about it. The dissent actually said that you're actually de facto legalizing this conduct. And the court said, it's nobody's business. So I kind of think I used that case numerous times to argue that we had legalized this de facto, not officially, but at the Florida bar, if you can't ask questions about it. But as a country, we didn't get to the point, there were still 13 states that made it a crime for people to engage in oral sex or anal sex, even if it was a straight couple, until Lawrence versus Texas came along and said, no, that's a constitutionally protected right. So when we look at this, it seems like it was a long time ago, but that's just 17 years ago when we joined the rest of the European. Russia did this in 1991, home of the free, that's the Netherlands or Denmark. It ain't here. That's for sure in terms of being progressive. But anyway.
Thank you. I guess is there anything that you all would like to share that you would particularly like to share with anyone practicing of what to really think about when it comes to clients who are part of the LGBTQ plus community? I'm sure there's lots of different things, but something, a few things that you might would like to make sure to share.
Oh, there's Tom.
Yeah. Zoom, I got a call. Well, I'm on my phone, sorry. I guess what I would share is, certainly when it comes to LGBTQ rights, David alluded to the recent decision of the Supreme Court that said that it's illegal to discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity in employment. And that's a huge, huge case. But I think the watershed case for LGBT rights is the case of Obergefell versus Hodges. That was in 2015. And that's the one where the US Supreme Court basically said in a 5-4 decision that same-sex marriage is protected under the due process and equal protection clauses of the 14th Amendment. And so as a result, same-sex marriage bans that existed in many, many states were struck down as unconstitutional. And all of a sudden, in one fell swoop, it became possible to get married. Again, I can't emphasize it enough. Until the turn of the century or so, and I think David can back me up on this. Of course, much progress was made in the later part of the century, but until the turn of the century, being a gay person was largely an underground experience for many people. They just kind of weighed and decided that the advantages of coming out were not as great as the disadvantages. So, that's when things really began to change. When I look back in my perspective as someone who edited a newspaper for 22 years, I look at two things that I think really, really began to change things, and they're just pop culture type things. But in 1997, Ellen came out. And Ellen, this very, very likable, very relatable comedian came out as gay. And so people all of a sudden had to say, well, I guess if I don't like lesbians, I don't like Ellen, and I like Ellen. So I think that was huge. And then in 1999, Will and Grace came on the air, and Will and Grace all of a sudden put these very likable gay people living lives that people would want to have in millions and millions of living rooms. It was on for a number of years, and it really, really impacted the way a lot of people thought about things. As far as same-sex marriage, it was a long journey. Back in 2004, same-sex marriage was legalized but only in Massachusetts. That was the only state that did it, and in Canada. So many people will go to either Massachusetts or Canada to get married, but it wasn't until 5 years later that the next states, Iowa and Vermont, joined Massachusetts. A number of states started granting civil unions, but even more went in the opposite direction. More states banned same-sex marriage, and Florida joined that group in 2008. In 2010, a Florida court ruled that Florida's ban on gay adoption by gay people, which was forbidden by statute in the state of Florida, the court ruled that that was unconstitutional. And the same year was the year, this was 2010, so it was only 10 years ago, that was the same year that Orlando included gays and lesbians in their non-discrimination ordinance that we talked about before. In 2011, Orlando created a domestic partner registry. Orange County did it in 2012, and that basically allowed domestic partners to do things like visit each other in the hospital and visit each other in prison, those kinds of things. And then, in 2015, you had Obergefell, which really importantly, of course, it meant that we could get married, but it also psychologically, emotionally, it meant that it recognized that our relationships are not of a lesser quality. Our love is not of a lesser quality than other people. In terms of estate planning, what Obergefell means is that if you marry, your spouse becomes your statutory default for both health care and inheritance, and that's whether you execute estate documents or not. But the flip side of it that a lot of people forget is that now LGBT people, if they get married and they break up, they have to get divorced. So that's sort of the yin and the yang of that. And so for my practice, it's led to a lot of people coming in seeking prenuptial agreements. I think there's there might be a misconception that, gay people are out at the disco or the bar and they might get married impulsively and it's not as thought out as maybe a heterosexual marriage or a traditional marriage. That's not been what my experience is at all. My experience is that most same-sex marriages are by people who've given it a lot of thought. And very often, they're at a point in their life where they've kind of set up separate careers and separate finances. I don't know. It'd be interesting to see whether the divorce rate for same-sex marriages is the same as other people. But based on my experience, and granted, the people who come into my office are probably the kind of people who think about these things. But based on my experience, I would guess that it's not great. Anyway, those are the little things that I wrote down that I kind of wanted to share in this context.
Could I just
Thank you.
add
Yeah,
on
go ahead.
what Tom said? It just made me think until 2015, when Jimmy and I could officially get married, for 35 years, he had to pay separate insurance. And it got to be, a gigantic amount as we got older. What a huge UCF, it was only maybe 2 or 3 years before that they had domestic partner. We were the last university in the state to do it. And so that's a huge thing. But guess where I was in, I think, probably April or May or whatever of 1977. I was doing an internship with the Florida Senate in bill drafting, drafting getting the language right. And I was on the floor when they voted on the provision to ban gay adoption. 2 senators voted against it. Bob Graham, who later became governor for 2 terms, and then senator for 3 terms, and a guy named Jack Gordon. That was it, 38-2. So that lets you know where you stood in 1977. And that was a really damaging thing to me because I always wanted to have kids. And I know you could get around it, but you'd have to, and it's really easy to get around it. You say I'm bisexual, so it just says homosexuals may not adopt. Fine, you can define yourself however you want to. I'm not saying you couldn't do that, but that's just a slap in the face. And I know what Jimmy and I did, and I think a lot of gay people have done something maybe in different ways. Maybe they haven't actually adopted or been foster parents, but I got a kid through 2 big brothers. I was very open about my status. The mother had been a former student of mine. he's now 44. He's been part of our family for 35 years. He's got a wife and 2 kids. We've taken him on, big. He was a kid, just because, again, father issues here with me. Guess where he got to go that I didn't get to go? He went to Sanibel 20 times, Chicago, caught a foul ball, it snowed, went to Washington, New York, and he went to frickin' Europe in 1990, and he got to see Germany win the World Cup with one of my German exchange students. We were in Berlin during the semifinals, and he got to see it downtown with the team. That's an experience, believe me, when a country wins the World Cup. And then the other thing Jimmy and I did, we had exchange students. We've had 4 Germans and 3 Russians. The Russians are they're all gone from Russia. One's a professor in Canada. 2 of them are lawyers here. And we're in contact with them all the time. So they're like family too. But that's what gay people kind of had to do, is create their own families. And we did it. I've got 8 kids, and I'm sending some cards off to a couple of the kids' grandchildren. And we get treated just like we're family members. So screw Anita Bryant, and I know nobody knows who that is, but and all the asshole church people. And by the way, if you read Ecclesiastes, where it says right there, and people can interpret the Bible differently. It says, if a man lieth with another man, he shall be stoned. In Colorado in 2012, the voters of Colorado legalized both gay marriage and marijuana. They read it differently than all those born-again Christian folks. That's a joke. Actually, it's a pretty good joke, but I'm kind of hearing something about rabbits right now, so I think I better shut up.
That's fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing that, David. Christina, do you have anything to share?
I mean, I think things have come a long way, especially since the early 2000s down here. But even now, I have 2 friends, 2 lesbians that, had a baby, and whoever didn't give birth still needs to go through and adopt and do a step-parent adoption. So it's still not equal. That's something that she can't be on the birth certificate when she's there, and I think that still needs to change. But I mean, we've made leaps and bounds compared to where we were. When I first moved to Florida, the Orange County ordinance wasn't here, and I wasn't out yet. I mean, I clearly wasn't hiding it well with my mohawk and not caring much, but I mean, I think, some things still need to change, and it's going to take more time and probably a different president.
And I'd like, sorry.
No.
Well, go ahead.
No, I was just saying, let's hope, let's hope and pray for a real president, anyone but this one. Just real quickly, so I don't forget it, Tom mentioned about and I think a lot of people wonder, well, why would somebody, go to a park or sneak around somewhere? Because they were afraid of being outed, and they were afraid. So what would happen is they may even be married, and they would sneak out and go somewhere. And no one's saying that's appropriate, but fortunately, the state attorney's office, back in 1979, I spoke with Lasse Lamar, who, if you know any history, he was our state attorney until 2012. Previously, he was our sheriff from 1980 to 1988. And I explained the situation to him. I said, these people should be treated just like if you caught a guy and a girl in a lounge parking lot, messing around in the car, and no one else was harmed, you ought to treat them the same way. You ought to send the case to pretrial diversion and not let this ruin their lives. And he said, I kind of agree with that. So he started doing that. Somehow he found out about my relationship with Gay Community Services, and he wanted to have lunch, and I wasn't important enough to have lunch with. But he said, listen, I'm running for sheriff next year, and I'd like support from the gay community, but it can't be open. It's got to be on the down low where nobody knows, or I have no chance of winning. but I'd really like your support, and I promise we will treat gay people fairly in the sheriff's department. And later on, he made the same promise for state attorney. And we helped, we organized a political action committee, supported him and another judge, Walt Kamansky, and we were the difference in both those elections. We delivered 3,000 votes. And so, you know, but it all had to be done like Tom mentioned, on the kind of the, not openly, or you'd kill your candidate's chance to win. And now, of course, people, you know, openly solicit the support of gay people. Well, that's a huge difference too. Politicians' reaction, and you know, I know with Barack Obama, he's been for gay marriage the whole time. He just knew how some people think we got to have everything right now. If we don't get it, we're going to take our ball and go home. You can't do it like that. You have to take your wins and then build on it and get the next win. And you won't ever get everything all at once, but if you're patient and you have the right strategy, you know, you have a chance. I just hope, you know, with the election that we kind of realize that maybe the better slogan should be demilitarize the police rather than defund the police or abolish the police, because all we're doing is helping Trump if we, you know, come along. I know that's a different topic,
but you know what,
yeah.
David, I think what's important to note from a historical perspective regarding those lewd and lascivious cases is that back in the 70s and 80s, there was no internet. You know, there were not chat rooms. There were few ways for particularly closeted gay people to meet each other. Many felt that going to a bar was too risky. They might run into somebody they know or be outed. Mm-hmm. So there were lots and lots of, you know, it was kind of underground, and word got around that you could go to this park or restroom or, you know, a restroom in a mall or something like that. And that's kind of the way men experience their homosexuality, many men, for decades.
And the Parliament House didn't open until 1976, and we had almost nothing, as you mentioned. You're absolutely right. I'm sorry, Tom, I interrupted. Go ahead.
Well, no, and then the police would go in there and arrest them, and I think it you know, I think it ruined many lives.
Good.
And it's just kind of the way it was. It's just,
you know, it was ironic. If you went to the Parliament House in the late 70s, early 80s, at least a third of the people there were straight people that went there so they could dance and have fun and go to a drag show. And I know I sounded real homophobic earlier because I didn't want to be a drag queen. I just, you know, that's not me. But I did get to learn.
Thank God.
Yes, thank God for that, in everything. But man, they did a lot for the community. They were the spokespersons for the community for a long time until people that maybe weren't could feel comfortable enough to come out. So I got to meet Miss P, and at the time when I met Jenny, she introduced me before we did the right before the drag show. That's how we got a good crowd, because everybody wanted to see Miss P. And you know, there are so many people that did so much stuff before us too, that and that took a lot of crap to get us to this point. And I know just all the stuff Tom did. I'm in awe of what Tom did for the community with the watermark and everything. It's and there are other attorneys too that we both know that did a lot, but I don't know of anybody that did more than Tom. So that's all to you.
Thanks, y'all. I guess if you have anything else that you wanted to share, I think, are we going till?
Yeah, 2:30.
2:30? Okay, perfect. All right, well, I've got plenty of questions, and I'm sure you guys have plenty to share. So, so yeah, if you guys could talk a little bit about, you know, some of the things that lawyers can, or people in law can actually do to make these changes? Like, if there are changes, the changes that we still need to make, like what are some of the ways to learn about what kind of issues are still, need to be addressed, and the LGBTQ plus community, and like where do they go to look for that? Are there certain journals that they should go to? Are there certain resources, and also kind of the way to, like you were talking about, what are some of the techniques in how to navigate that, that are maybe particular to the LGBTQ plus community. Like you talked about, sometimes it's not saying everything all the time. Sometimes it is, it probably depends, but I'm just throwing out a question there.
Could I ask Christina something? I know when you mentioned the stuff about people calling you sir and not changing it, and has it ever been an attorney that did that, or when you said a magistrate did it? Yeah, I mean, it is up to you, and I think you may be right that it's not worth it, but the bar would definitely punish someone that did something like that. I'm sure you know that, but
Yeah, to me, honestly, I think it's petty. I think it's childish behavior. I think, for me at the time, I was a young attorney. I was maybe 27, 28. Like, I had just come out of law school, just started practicing. And I was more taken aback that a grown man would act like that.
yeah.
And to me, I was like, well, if I start calling the bar, he clearly already doesn't like me from the look of me.
Right.
If I do one thing wrong, he's going to jump all over my bar card. And I was a baby attorney. I honestly I took it more of, it's kind of sad.
Yeah, and you don't want to hurt your clients. You don't want to hurt your clients, obviously.
Right.
That's your first obligation, but it's just really crappy. I think an issue that's going to come up, and it has come up, but what do you do when someone comes in and introduces another constitutional right? Well, my right to practice my religion would allow me to deny you service or deny you the right to come in and eat at my restaurant. We've already had that kind of nebulous decision about the baking the cake, but I think that's something that's that the right wing is certainly, I think something like 27, 28 states have adopted religious freedom restoration acts, which again do that. I'm just wondering if Tom, has anything like that come up in your practice, or do you know of anything? Because I'm kind of out of the loop since I stopped practicing in 2006.
Well, not in the context of estate planning have I had to deal with any issues of constitutional rights to religion, but I do think, I think Christina's right. There are still areas that challenges that continue to remain, and sometimes they are based on religion, which I really think in most cases is really just a cover for prejudice and homophobia. But I think where we are now is we've reached a sort of critical mass where the vast majority of the population supports gay and lesbian equality, gay and lesbian marriage. It's sort of reached a point of saturation in the culture where, for most people that's accepted, but transgender issues of gender identity, there a lot of education has to be done. People are still uncomfortable with that issue, the issue of gender fluidity and what all that means and what it means in a legal context. And I think that's probably, the next challenging area. And again, it's, on TV and in movies, it's being addressed. People are being educated, but for a lot of people, they're not there. And it's all part of the same umbrella, and we have to be supportive of that.
Kind of one of our attorneys, professors at UCF, Irene Pons, took a transgender case, and I don't remember, I think the case was still pending the last time I spoke to her, but Amy, I think you're nodding that you may know something about that, but
I think there's a story that UCF Today published about her work with that case.
yeah,
I'll see if I can find it and put it in the chat room.
yeah, but it's,
It's the case of a Miss Julie Mayfield who was, or who is an individual with XXY chromosomes, and they were petitioning the state of Florida, mainly the Ninth Judicial Circuit, to have a judge sign an order saying that Miss Mayfield met the requirements that were needed in order for her to be able to change the gender identity on her, I believe it's Alabama birth certificate. However, it was denied here in Osceola County, saying that the judge didn't have the jurisdiction to make that decision for another state. So it's very unfortunate. I believe the case is still going with.
Lisa just sent a chat or an answer to that. I think you're right, Sean. And
Okay.
I think she said it's on appeal now.
Yes.
And I think that's in the chat, if I'm not mistaken.
I believe the ACLU is actually helping with it now as well.
Next step is to appeal. Lisa helped us out on that one. Yeah. So I just remember her working on that and put a lot of work into it pro bono to help out on it. So kudos.
Yeah, I just put the article in the chat room. That helps. Okay. Let's see. Is there anything that's coming up for you all that you are, looking at when it comes to law and the, intersection of law and LGBTQ plus issues? And if not, that's okay.
Well, there are a few things. A lot of this stuff is governed by state law, state statute, and Florida, with the Republican-led both chambers of the legislature and the governor, they are not inclined to expand LGBT protection. So that's something that it has to be watched. Democratic legislators, state legislators, have introduced for many, many years non-discrimination protections that will extend not only to employment but public accommodations and all of that stuff. And I mean, believe it or not, people are not willing to embrace that. In 2020, our legislature won't even bring it up for a hearing. So much of this happens at the state level. Florida, with gerrymandering and the like, despite its very mixed population, has a very conservative state legislature. So that's still work to be done.
Yeah, how in the world can you have more registered Democrats and yet it be 26-14 in the Senate and almost 2-1?
Well, you know the answer.
Yeah, that's Jerry, right? Jerry Mander. Yeah, another Jerry I went to law school with. Yeah, Republican. Yeah, good, but they know how to cheat, don't they? They've got that perfected to an art. That's why it's important to get out and vote. And if you're, please, and I know this isn't the issue of the day, but please, if you're voting and you think, well, I don't know, Joe Biden, come on, I'm not real excited. I wish it was Bernie, and I may just not vote. That's what you did the last time, and that's how we got Trump. Get off your ass, get out there and vote. If you really are voting for Trump, which I think is somewhat unlikely if you're listening to this thing, but if you are, the election is in the first week of December. I just wanted to get that out there for anyone. In fact, is still a supporter. So, but we got to vote. If we don't vote, we're going to be stuck in a bad situation and can't remember who he was threatening last night. I'll find out once this is done, but I think there were some more threats. The flag burning. He wants he wants Congress. Wow, is he stupid? That's already been decided years ago. And if you're a conservative, if you got a brain, of course, that's problematic. If in fact you still think this guy's the right choice. But if you got a brain, if you're really a conservative, who bought the flag? You. Who gets to decide what to do with your own property? That would be you, not the government, if you're really a conservative and you're able to understand what that means to be a conservative. You don't let the government tell you what to do with your own private property. So whether you're conservative or liberal, you should, well, I don't like it. That's fine. You don't have to like it, but it's the other guy's property, so it ain't none of my business. You should be able to come up with that rational thought about flag burning. In addition, the Supreme Court's already decided it. They're not going to reverse that decision. It is constitutionally protected. You can do what you want to do with your own property, but your flag, you can burn it. And it's understandable if you've been treated the way some people have been treated. I'm a white guy, and even being gay, I've never had my government mistreat me the way it's mistreated African Americans and other people of color. I mean, there's no question about that. It's obvious to anyone that's ever experienced it. And if since we got a little time to kill, please, you can bring up the rabbits anytime you want. But a guy that I just admired so much, a guy named Dave Mose, was a professor in criminal justice. He was the first African American chief of police, or second in command, I can't remember which, in Chicago. He has pictures with 3 different presidents, and Martin Luther King and Nelson Mandela. He went over there before he came to us to help him set up security when he became president of South Africa. He was in the Tuskegee Airmen. Can you imagine if you did that? If you don't know what that is, look it up. I think you should. Can you imagine fighting for your country and coming back and you can't eat lunch, you can't get a cab? Can you imagine that, having that done to you? You can understand why he might want to burn a flag. He never did. All of his kids have at least master's degree, all 4 of them. He didn't do it, but I can understand it. Or if you were Japanese and you were treated the way they were, put in internment camps. But if you're a white person, particularly a white male, there's some kind of privilege, I think it's called, but that's never happened to me. And if it hasn't happened to you, that's why you need to talk to people. Talk to people that are different from you. It's the best advice. Killer Mike, not a big fan of his music, but he's a really smart guy. His advice was, for God's sake, make your circle of friends wider. Talk to some Black people, not just one. My sister-in-law is trying to do that in Canada. There's one Black woman, and not family. And she was telling my sister-in-law, I'm so tired of being everyone's Black friend up here in Bracebridge, Canada, because she's the only one in the community. So try not to load it all on one person, but have different friends, get some different perspectives. Sorry, go ahead.
David,
Go ahead.
I was just curious, Christina, you mentioned like there are still things that fall through the cracks. So you mentioned like a married lesbian couple who has a baby has issues trying to get both names on the birth certificate. That's just, that's a small, but it's a, there are lots of things that continue to fall through the cracks. And I'm just curious, from your perspective, you're quite a bit younger than David and me. What do you see as the next big challenges for LGBT, legal equality?
I think legally there's going to be huge issues with the gender fluidity because people just don't understand it. And I think the people that don't understand it also don't want to be educated on it. So I think that's going to take a long time.
I do too.
I don't foresee that being even within 5 years, unfortunately. People, what they don't know, they don't understand, or they think this is just nonsense. And that's, I think, going to continually fall through the cracks. I think the next real issue that's going to come to fruition is going to be for, gay couples and lesbian couples that are either adopting children or having children. They're going to run into issues down the line, whether it's with surrogacy or the having to go out, because a lot of couples, it's not a cheap process to to go through in the in vitro. And then after that, they now have to hire an attorney to, we know as attorneys, it's not a hard process to do that adoption, the step parent adoption, which is what it is, but it's not the same. It's not how it is. It's expensive, really, is what it is. And I know my friends that had to do it were upset by it.
Well, it's a little insulting, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's going to be the next issue that's going to come to the forefront, because it's happening more now. And people aren't going to continue to just accept that this is a step parent adoption. That's not what they are. That's not who they are to this child, yet states aren't going to accept them being a biological parent or a true parent. And I think that's the next big thing that needs to change. And the gender fluidity, I think, is going to be the biggest issue for this community moving forward.
What do you think the community can do, or what something similar to what just be a topic of conversation that you need to bring up and try to get people educated on, or how would you suggest?
I think it's just going to be a matter of education. People need to understand, and I think that needs to happen from people that are in that gender fluidity space. It's one thing for any one of us to explain it, but I think it's better coming from someone who's in that position and views themselves that way to explain it. But at the end of the day, you can, lead a horse to water. I don't think anybody's gonna, unfortunately, I think in the current culture of this country, I don't think anybody's gonna listen.
One question I have, actually, because I know sometimes folks talk about like educating yourself before asking other people as well. Like, so are there resources, and this could be for, the students kind of looking at these types of laws, and but to understand the complexity of these, where might they go online to educate themselves, or, in, again, like journals or other areas like that, or are there certain lawyers that you think they might look up to familiarize themselves with?
Well, there's a Central Florida Gay and Lesbian Lawyers Association that has dozens of members, and there's you can Google that and find their website, and they have a directory of members listed by areas of practice. So that's a really useful tool that I use all the time, because so often LGBT people will call me and they've got an issue that is not something that I do, but they want somebody who who understands where they're coming from, and they don't want to have to deal with that. So that's a good resource. And then, as if people want to do research and reading, there are journals, legal journals that focus specifically on LGBT issues. Off the top of my head, I can't. There are some law schools in California that I believe have those. I really don't remember them off the top of my head, but very easy to find via Google.
Awesome.
We also have a course. I know we do. Maria Breckman teaches it, and I know we were discussing it before. I believe it's gender, sex discrimination, and the law. But I know there are other courses, and there is a gay and lesbian, bisexual, and I'm sure there's maybe more trans student union at UCF. So that certainly could be a great source for people that want more information.
Agreed. Well, thank you guys, and of course, like you were saying, Christina, reaching out to folks, and I love all that you guys have shared. It looks like we are at 2:30, and I just want to thank each of you for sharing your stories and sharing your knowledge. And we really, really appreciate you taking the time out to talk to us. So,
Thank you.
Thank you.
so very much. And thank you all for joining us.
Thanks, Christina. Thanks, Tom.
Thanks.
Take care.
Thank you, John, too, for helping to put this on. We really appreciate it. And thanks for everybody that attended.
Yes, thank you all for participating. And like Amy said at the beginning, this has been recorded the entire time, and we will be posting it on our Legal Studies website as well as on all our social media accounts. So thank you again.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Bye all.
Thanks, guys.